racism is more modern than we realize.
When did such a concept emerge?
I think there's more to it than just being a racial theme as we understand it today.
If it's not supposed to be skin color, what we should understand it as? What are your thoughts there?
Our faith stands strong. It has a sure foundation despite all the mistakes we've made throughout our history.
Was Joseph Smith racist himself?
Can we still hold them to the standard of a prophet, though? Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sword and Spirit. My name is Daniel. I'm here with my co-host, David. And today we're joined by a special friend of mine. We're joined by Zander Sturgill. Zander, how are you doing today?
Good, guys. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you on today, especially for today's discussion, today's discussion is going to be talking about racism, or specifically within the context of scriptures and just that overall topic. It's a pretty controversial topic. Either people oftentimes will accuse people that are of maybe Native American descent, or more specifically African descent, of why would you be in a church that had these certain views of blacks or Native Americans and the treatment that was given. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But just before we jump into today's topic, Zander, if you could just take a few minutes, just for those that don't know who you are, let's just introduce yourself. I'm going to have you just introduce yourself, and we'll just talk about your upbringing in the gospel, what you do in apologetics or as a career, and we'll just go up to that point, and then we'll go into today's discussion.
Yeah, my name is Zander Sturgill, and I'm got a degree in digital media, so I'm like a video editor. I'm a producer. I worked for almost a decade with Scripture Central, kind of behind the camera, but also became great friends with a lot of Latter-day Saint scholars and researchers and apologists. And I'm also Native American, and as I've been traveling around the world with different people, learning the history of Latter-day Saints, I started to kind of realize that the Native American perspective wasn't really being told, or had been forgotten or suppressed or neglected. And that started concerning me a lot. And then I started realizing how easy of low-hanging fruit it is for people who are questioning the church or critical of the church or concerned with the church. And I saw that manifest itself with things like, did you guys ever hear about the TV series?
Yes, was it? I believe so. Where I can't remember
American
what it was called.
Primeval.
Yes, that's right. American Primeval.
Yeah,
Yep.
I noticed that, and I was like, good storytelling, good cinematography, stuff I like, but from a historical perspective, they're taking 3 different events and pushing them into one story, the Bear River Massacre, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the Utah War, putting them all into one and making it look worse than it really is. And it is bad, and there's things that we need to fix and address, but making it worse than it was. I started reading essays by people who are questioning the church about how the Book of Mormon is inherently colonialistic and suppressive of Native Americans. And I had grown up with different perspectives and research about the Book of Mormon that I didn't think they were addressing in this type of stuff. And so probably maybe about 3 months ago, I really got serious and started my own YouTube channel to kind of address this stuff, Native Americans and Latter-day Saint issues. Sometimes it goes into a bit of politics, but because Native American issues pop up in politics even today. That's kind of like my hobby, my personal channel. I have a full-time job here at the Ancient America Foundation. That's why I have this nice background. I couldn't afford something like that. But and on the Ancient America Foundation YouTube channel, I just make videos about the Ancient Americas. They're not religious, or they don't talk about the Book of Mormon or anything. They just talk about ancient history because we want to just spread more awareness of the Ancient Americas. So that's my full-time job, and then my personal project is this Native American Latter-day Saints channel, just under my name.
Awesome. That's a great introduction. And so first and foremost, thank you for that. And I think your insights, I think, are very useful, just to understanding kind of a subgroup that isn't, I think, discussed enough, because we understand some of the history And oftentimes you had the Latter-day Saints in the early days of the church who would oftentimes refer to specifically Native Americans as Lamanites. And so I think there's a lot of rich history behind that. And I love how you mentioned, a few of those massacres. I want to just real quick, just kind of talk about those real quick, because one of the things that a lot of people may say is, well, Latter-day Saints are bloodthirsty people. But before we just go more into specifically what we're going to talk about today, I want to just go there real quick. For Latter-day Saints, can you just, as someone that can relate to both sides, what is kind of the history with these massacres, especially within the accusation that Latter-day Saints are like bloodthirsty people or committed atrocities? Can you just give us a little bit of context for what's going on in these scenarios that you discussed or that you mentioned?
Yeah, and we need to think about the context, because it's not fair for us to put our modern perspectives on ancient history, even if it's just like in the 19th century, right? Utah back then was the Wild West, and, even Butch Cassidy came from Utah, and he was actually a Latter-day Saint. He actually kind of got me into this too, because Butch Cassidy was a Latter-day Saint. He left the church. He became an outlaw. He lived out in the countryside. He lived a crazy life where you don't have, flushing toilets and air conditioning, and, any day a rattlesnake can kill you, right? So it's a totally different world than what we live in, even today. And so the Saints come into Utah, and they have high hopes about Native Americans. They want to convert them, but I always say that they brought with them cultural baggage that they had on them. They had these ideas that the entire United States and Americas from Europeans had about Native Americans, and that affected them. And some people take it too far and say the Book of Mormon caused these extreme ideas, but we really see this stuff all over the Americas. Native Americans were less, and they had to kind of other people to kind of justify what they were doing, because Latter-day Saints were coming here, living on their land, and then you have these two different groups with totally different ways of living, right? And sometimes people want to say that Latter-day Saints were colonizers and they came here to suppress Native Americans. I think we forget that they were persecuted and pushed out of the East, and they were kind of forced here. It wasn't 100% their plan. They had plans to come out here, but I'm sure they would have loved to stay out there if they could. So they were kind of forced out here with this cultural baggage that they brought, two different ways of living on the land. Native Americans generally shared resources and kind of were aware of how their land worked with seasons and water and migrations. Latter-day Saints came and built fences and had cattle, right? And, cattle, back then, cattle was huge. There was herds and herds all over the area, right? Just eating up all the grass and affecting the whole terrain. And, if a Native American sees a horse or a cow out in the middle of nowhere, they'll treat it like a deer, right, on their own land and take it, right? To Latter-day Saints, that became stealing. That became a crime. And really quickly, you start seeing these two different ways of life conflicting with each other. Both of them did violence. Both of them had their justifications. I think it's not really fair to say one side was perfect and the other side wasn't. They're just two different cultures. But Latter-day Saints had the better technology, and conflicts happened. People were accused of crimes. People shot back. It escalated really quick, and then you have things like the Utah Valley massacres that happened here just a few years after Latter-day Saints arrived. You got the Bear River Massacre, Circle River Massacre. You got several different massacres all over the area of Native Americans being killed by Latter-day Saints. A lot of times in these stories, it's a few kind of extreme Latter-day Saints, not always church leadership, right? Church leadership tried to quell these things, but There's stories here in Utah Valley of a few Latter-day Saints killing a Native American man and throwing his body in the lake, and that upset the Native Americans, of course, right? Brigham Young didn't know about that. So it's really complicated. It's not stuff we know as Latter-day Saints, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, is because, we always tell the story of the saints, the pioneers trekking across the plains, and then we celebrate Pioneer Day, and we don't really realize how Pioneer Day is a Latter-day Saint holiday, but for Native Americans, Pioneer Day was kind of the beginning of the end. And then we stopped telling the story there of what happened. There's the Black Hawk War that happened here in Utah, which was the most costliest war here, but hardly anyone knows about it, and there's dozens of battle sites all scattered throughout Utah. So I want to tell these stories. For one thing, I'm just a history nerd. I think most of us are we love history and to nerd out on it and stuff, and so I just like going to places and filming it and seeing it and experiencing it. I like to share that, but I also want to share the stories in a more accurate way so it's not misused in like the American primeval way.
Thank you for that very helpful context to avoid our lens of presentism, which just comes attached to every single person. We live in our day and age. We're not exempt from our presentist lenses. And of course, people in 200, 300 years from now are going to look back at us barbarians. And we should have some charity in the past. So, but thank you for that. So that is a good segue into our main topic for today, which is, of course, race in Scripture and in Latter-day Saint history. Now, when we talk about race, this is like a kind of fuzzy concept where we just say it and we assume we know what it means. But could you tell us what race is and when did such a concept emerge?
Yeah, it is interesting. You guys are audio guys and video guys. I did lots of audio and video editing. Almost 10 years ago, a podcast was an audio only, and that word has completely changed today. And me as an audio engineer, that makes me mad sometimes. When someone talks about a reel I made and says, "Hey, I liked your podcast," in my head I'm like, that's not a podcast. But now I have to accept what a podcast is today. It's a different term. It's a different meaning. A podcast to so many people, especially older generations, a podcast are videos or something like that, right? I still haven't been able to define it, but usually, if someone's doing a Come Follow Me series, people say, "I love your podcast." I'm always like, "Oh, you mean video podcast," right? So words change and meanings change over time, and they don't always mean the same thing, and it changes quick, as we saw with that one. With racism, I've been kind of blown away how many different perspectives have changed. In the 17th century, 14th century, even 19th century. Just kind of one example of something I learned about is the Industrial Revolution. I didn't realize that, I thought the Industrial Revolution was a natural human civilization development. But the Industrial Revolution actually happened in rare circumstances where people on the British Isles cut down all their trees, and so they had to get creative, and they found coal and human labor, mixed that together, and that suddenly exploded into an industrial revolution. But that's not necessary, and lots of civilizations have gone on without it. But that affected our entire world for good, and probably for worse too. We don't sometimes think how, if we study history, some of these things are actually kind of rare like that. With racism, that's also pretty, not rare. I mean, if you define racism by thinking of someone as an other person, a separate person, and this tribal mentality, that's always been around in ancient times. But have we always thought of people less for their skin color? That's a different question. And we see in history that with the slave trade and things like that, that really kind of codified what racism is. That's when you start seeing people looking at people who are dark-skinned as less than others. Whereas a bit before that, people thought of each other more based on culture or language or geography, right? They didn't think of them as much as skin. In fact, there were ancient civilizations that were dark-skinned, that were heavily advanced. And so they'd recognize, even in the Near East and stuff, with Greeks and Egyptians and stuff, they'd recognize that civilizations could be intelligent even if they were darker skinned. So I didn't think about it this way. We made it that way largely because of the slave trade and other things to help us kind of justify othering other people for this business that we were creating. And then it just kind of, blew up from there into Joseph Smith's time, where now they're using the scriptures to justify slave trade that was even happening during his time, right? And so you got to kind of study the history and see what's happening around him and what led up to it, not just assume it was always this way. And, I think members will make the mistake of thinking has always been looked this way. You think of someone less. Ancient people thought of other people as less if they had darker skin. I think on the other end, people critical of the church, they actually don't give us a bone or anything for the Book of Mormon being an ancient text and assuming that, hey, maybe they're not talking about racism here as we know it. Maybe they're talking about the ancient form of othering other people and stuff like that. So, racism is more modern than we realize. That doesn't mean thinking of other people less has never been. That's always happened. And you even see it in the Book of Mormon with the Nephites and Lamanites thinking of each other as less. But it was more of a cultural thing, a geography thing, than we might think about it. As you were talking about presentism, bringing our own thoughts of racism onto the text. And, it's not just racism. Sometimes we read the Book of Mormon with different lenses. We might bring our political lens on it and see a verse and say, hey, that's talking about the United States right there, when really it's not, right? We're just bringing our kind of nationalistic lens onto this. Happens with every country and nation and stuff. It's beyond politics. It happens everywhere we see. So we got to just kind of be careful about what lens we're reading the Book of Mormon with.
I like that. And I think that's very helpful to understand the lenses that we use are very important, especially how we read things. And that's not just the same for certain passages in the scriptures that may seem racist in a certain extent, but it can also do with, as President Nelson said, and so last week's episode we had, or I believe it was, last week's episode we had Ben Spackman on talking specifically about science and religion, and it's a very similar thing to understand. Okay, what do we think the author meant? What was the intent and the author's context to understand these specific passages, and do we need to interpret them like that? So I think that's just spot on. One of the things I wanted to ask, though, in regard to this is, so we've established that the context and understanding the context of these certain passages are very important. But we also see, certain scriptural passages that even within our 21st century mindset, we try to understand what the author meant. And we're like, okay, but this seems very much like they're talking about people's skin color. Again, I think 2 Nephi 5:21-23 is a prime example. Is a prime example of that. So I wanted just to talk about that real quick. Could you elaborate a little bit on skin color in scriptures, or like terms such as skin, black, white? Because oftentimes we do interpret it as our skin color. So could you just elaborate a little bit on scriptural curses? If it's not supposed to be skin color, what we should understand it as? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, a lot of people who are questioning or critical or have concerns about the church, honest concerns about the Book of Mormon, will point at verses like that. But I mean, the Bible, I have a couple scriptures here. Job 30:30 says, "My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat." So it's talking about supposedly skin of blackness right here. Supposedly, right? Lamentations 5:10. "Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine." And you see similar stuff in the Quran, right? Faces blackening in the day of judgment. But these here are specifically talking about skin. But when you go into like the ancient Hebrew meaning of what this means. You get verses like Nahum 2, where it says, "And all the faces of them gather blackness." When you look into the research behind what that means, blackness in this case could be frustration, somber. So it's more about a state of being than actual skin color in these scriptures. So for one thing, if people are going to accuse the Book of Mormon as being racist, point out the Bible too and say, hey, the Bible says the same thing here. And then point out how it's not talking about skin color here. These are like ancient idioms of comparing black and white, good and bad, right and wrong, bond and free, male and female. It's comparing these different states here. And so when you bring that kind of ancient lens and then put it on the Book of Mormon, different passages start coming to life in different ways that aren't our modern, 20th century ideas of racism. Instead, they're these ancient ideas of it. Now, so there's several ways to look at verses like skin of blackness in it. The first is that no one has a skin of blackness. We're all just shades of brown, right? And scientifically, we're all just the same, right? And it's really just, whiter, lighter skin adapted from going up north where they didn't need that adaptation to survive under the sun, so the skin naturally changed, right? There's no such thing as black and white. And if you bring that to the text, then you can start opening up ideas of, okay, what does this mean? If you bring to the text this idea that ancient people thought of black and white differently, what can this mean? So one of them is one approach is just kind of thinking of it more as symbolic. Black and white being pure and evil or cursed. Black is associated with curses a lot. And we do have evidence where Joseph Smith at one point actually changed a reference of white and delightsome. He changed it to pure and delightsome in his lifetime, as if he's saying, hey, this is not about skin, this is about being pure, right? And so we get support for this symbolic idea. In Lehi's dream, he's always comparing the dark wilderness, the dark river, the dark mist. He's using this strong dark language, just like they use dark skin, but this dark wilderness compared to the white fruit, the white Virgin Mary, who, Mary was Middle Eastern. She wouldn't have been white, the white robes of the angel. He's making these comparisons, which they would do. So there's some point for more symbolic interpretation of it, which I think it's great when you actually find ancient support for it. You want to see this happening in the ancient world, and we see it happening in the Bible. We've seen it happening even within the text itself with Lehi's dream and stuff like that. Several other approaches. One is looking at it as clothing. So a lot of times when it talks about skin of blackness, it's right next to references of a skin girded about their loins. So you got skin blackness, skin loins, right next to each other, suggesting a clothing application. And Ethan Sprout has done a lot of research about how every time it mentions the skin, it's also next to a temple reference. And in ancient Hebrew theology, you have Adam and Eve with their skin of garments, their coats of skins, and it would contrast their garments of light with the garments that they were, their fallen state garments, right? More symbology, but this time manifested with clothing. You got ancient people in the Book of Mormon who dye their skins red. So you see them using clothing symbolically to make a point. And then another third option, which is my favorite because I do a lot of Native American research and stuff, and I've been blown away by how much Native Americans, North, Central, South, painted their skins. They paint their entire bodies. So the third approach is that it could be body paint or tattoos or something like that. And when Christopher Columbus first came into the Americas, his journal says they paint their whole bodies black. Like this stuck out to them. He noticed it. And it could be that, when Nephi and them saw this, it stuck out to them too. And they talked about a skin of blackness. And a lot of times when ancient Americans would paint their skins. It was kind of a way to differentiate yourself between other groups. You have murals in ancient America, in the ancient Maya world, where you have murals of black people and white people. And, at first, Latter-day Saints thought this was evidence of black skin and white skin people. When they saw it, they're putting their own presentism perspective onto this cultural baggage that they brought with them onto these Maya murals. But archaeologists soon found out that no, they were actually painting their skins, or they were identifying different groups by completely painting them. And so the Book of Mormon, I think, comes to life with this idea. You also have really good examples in the text of the Amlicites painting their foreheads red. And it specifically says that was God's curse. So when you look at the text, what a curse is, for these guys at least, it's painting their heads red. And they bring it on themselves. And so now you have evidence in the text of a curse being body paint. Now, I don't necessarily think it is one of these three options. I think it could be that it's symbolic, but for some reason in the ancient Americas, and it probably happened all over the ancient world, they brought out this symbology physically on them with body paint. So I think it's both. I don't remember what passage this is in the Book of Mormon, but there's a passage where it talks about at the last day, Christ washing our garments clean in his blood and then becoming pure and white. That is both symbolic and clothing, right? And you're seeing it right there in the same verse. You can imagine these ancient peoples bringing this to life on themselves by painting themselves. And the best thing about that is it happened, you see it everywhere. Here in Utah, we have some really awesome petroglyphs, pictographs by the Barrier Canyon style. These date to up to 10,000 years ago, probably more like 1 AD and back. And there are these haunting red pictographs on the canyon walls with these big eyes. But the evidence suggests that this red paint they would also apply to themselves to kind of bring to life their mythology. There's practical reasons. You could paint your body to protect you from mosquitoes, right? You could paint your body in a war context so that that don't kill the people who have this paint on them, kill the other people, right? And you could paint your body to show your loyalty. And so for me, the skin of blackness kind of comes to life when Nephi says that the Lamanites are now painting their skin. In a way, it looks like the Lamanites are adopting this custom and symbolically separating themselves from the people of God by doing this, by adopting a new people and tradition on them. And now that's separating themselves, that's cursing them and marking them. Now there's a difference between the curse and the mark. And the curse is very clearly being separated from God. We see that in the Bible as well. Cursing's meant being separated to God. And you even see that with stories about, Cain and Abel, Cain. And unfortunately, we turn that ourselves into Cain being cursed with black skin, and now every black person is evil, or Ham or something like that. I think it was Ham. We turned it that way, but the cursing was being separated from God. The cursing from the Lamanites was being separated from God and the people. So I think there's more to it when thinking about skin of blackness than just bringing in this modern interpretation onto it and saying, hey, let's, for one thing, you could look at it as an ancient text, which comes to life. Like, that's what I love doing. Look at the Book of Mormon as an ancient text and study the ancient world and see what comes to life there. The other approach is just look at what the text says. Separate what Brigham Young and Joseph Smith said, because like every person, they're influenced by this culture around them. Let's look at what just the text says about this, and not let other people's interpretations influence us on what it says, and get some ideas and bring in an ancient lens, bring in a scientific lens. It's impossible for people to have black skin, and see what we can get from that. So I think there's more to it than just being a racial thing as we understand it today.
Well said. And that's like a fantastic overview of the different interpretive possibilities that are open for interpreters of the text. And it kind of highlights one core conflicting assumption whenever this issue comes up is we as Latter-day Saints believe that this text is a 19th century translation of an ancient source, whereas people who would maybe leverage this criticism are automatically assuming that this is purely a 19th century product. And so if we assume, and I think there's good evidence, and I think you have done a lot of good work on this as well with the Ancient America Foundation, that it is an ancient text, then we have a lot of ancient interpretations open to us. And I think that means, at least when I look at them, a lot of them fit really well. It's just maybe scholars can debate here and there which one has the most explanatory power and whatnot. So that's a fantastic overview of how we should read like 2 Nephi 5, Jacob 3, 2 Nephi 20, all of those different texts. So transitioning now from this ancient context more to like Joseph Smith and early Latter-day Saint history, what was there like ideas of racism like around Joseph Smith's time? Kind of what were they? What was like Joseph Smith's like cultural milieu for racism? And was Joseph Smith racist himself?
I mean, again, he's living in a culture deeply seated with racial tensions. I mean, you have slavery. It's like one of the main topics politically, right? You know, think of the main topics politically today and how much those are in the top of our heads. That was in the top of their heads, you know, and it affects how you read the scriptures. I learned about this recently, but in 1830, when the Book of Mormon was published, was when the Indian Removal Act was enacted, which forced Native Americans out. I think it was west of the Mississippi. I can't remember exactly, but that happened just as the Book of Mormon was published. So that's a big topic happening in their world then and there, right? So now this is in their brains. They're trying to figure out what this all means. You know, it's kind of like thinking about immigration today and what do the scriptures say, and people will find all sorts of justifications for and against it, even in the church, right? You see that happening in Joseph Smith's time. And so those are all on top of his head. Now, Joseph Smith is kind of surprisingly very open, and all people are alike, not just with, we've got quotes of him saying, I would die for the Presbyterian and the other person just as much as I would die for a Mormon. And Joseph Smith ran on a presidency to slowly undo slavery. I don't remember the exact campaign it was, but it was really neat for that time. And he had these ideas about Native Americans being a promised people. And so he was pretty unique, I think, but still he had this cultural baggage on him that, you know, as they were interpreting the world and the scriptures, that's how they would interpret the Book of Mormon as well. And with Brigham Young and stuff and everyone, I mean, and, you know, I think my biggest thing is, in some ways, I actually agree with people who are critical of the church about this racist stuff we've done, to the point where I think I agree with them that we do need to fix some things. There's some things that we should probably change. Like, do we sing Book of Mormon stories in our primaries and do the symbols behind our head, or should we change the images in the Book of Mormon of these white European Viking guys in the ancient Americas? I like that they're pointing this stuff out. Where I think they go too far is then to say the Book of Mormon caused this, or it's inherent in our religion, when really I think we need to say, hey, it's this kind of cultural baggage that we are bringing into it, and let's work on that together. In Latter-day Saints, we can keep the Book of Mormon and the core truths of our faith, and it's not going to affect the core ideas of Jesus or prophets or priesthood, but we are going to have to adjust and kind of weed out some things to help us fix some problems and become better. And then I think that's hard. Like I try to do this online, And a lot of times Latter-day Saints think I'm some type of anti-Mormon or liberal or something for doing that. But really what I think is after we do some of this cleaning up, weeding out, we'll see that the Book of Mormon and the Gospel are brighter and better than they were, right? And so as I think we need to kind of change this lens that we bring upon the Book of Mormon, and I think it's happening. And I think the church is doing great stuff with racism, and they're starting to do stuff with Native American themes. And so I'm just hoping to be, kind of there helping out and pushing it and, promoting it and things like that. So was Joseph Smith racist? Yeah, everyone was pretty much, right? Everyone was part of their culture, and the Book of Mormon is there trying to bring us out of this. I mean, it was the gospel of Christ was in the Book of Mormon trying to bring the Nephites out of their own tribalism and racism in the form of othering other people, right? The Book of Mormon is all about this anti-discriminatory, no more ites, we're all just children of God. Even the Lamanites can be more righteous than the Nephites. All are alike unto God. The Book of Mormon is actually trying to get us out of that. And so sometimes I'll read church history and stuff and be like, oh man, this church historical figure, if only he took this verse in the Book of Mormon more seriously, right? Now it's his opinion that's doing harm, not the Book of Mormon. And those are the stuff I think we need to fix. And it happened with saints, and I think we need to admit that a bit more, but also see how it's not going to affect our core faith.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's very well put of what I think that's very well put of what you were just saying, and I think it's very helpful to just kind of what you're saying, to understand why that's important, and because I think we see the mistakes that certain leaders have made in regard to maybe certain racist statements, and I'm curious, would you say that the reason why certain leaders took, for example, the curse of Cain or the curse of Ham, was a big part of it? Basically what you were saying, if I'm understanding correctly, was a lot of that was the cultural baggage that they were bringing to these texts or these scriptures, and because of the culture that was influencing their opinions, certain decisions, that they were using these cultural implications or cultural mindsets to interpret the scriptures. Is that that's kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah. I think they were using the culture of the time, the understanding of their time. What is it? The Lord says He speaks to us in our own language and understanding, and we learn line upon line, precept upon precept. God isn't going to reveal to them the science of the pigmentation in our skin and how the sun changes it, right? We're going to learn about that. He's trying to get us to think of each other as equals, but mankind has just a history and a natural man inclination to other people and to justify othering people. And sometimes we've done it through scriptures, and we've done it through the Bible throughout history. And so a lot of it's kind of justification as well to, if you've taken Native American land, and you might excuse it by saying, hey, they need to be civilized because the Book of Mormon says so, right? When really the Book of Mormon doesn't say that, but they're taking things, they're interpreting things by their own culture. The other thing is that, like, archaeology wasn't even a thing back then. It was kind of became a solid field after the Book of Mormon was published, after the saints were established. And so people interpreted the age of the world and everything by the Bible, basically, and that was where truth was. And so they didn't have the tools. I like to say that they didn't have the tools necessary to help them figure this all out. As we got more science and tools like that and understanding, The other thing is the Latter-day Saints. They were being persecuted over and over and driven from city to city. So it's really hard to actually sit down and study out the Book of Mormon. They tried to, they had the School of Prophets and stuff like that. So they tried to, but that's hard to do when you're being forced out of your own country and things like that. And so I can't really blame them for not being perfect or for not being up to the standards of our 20th century ideals. But hey, even today we have ideas that people 100 years from now will probably be like, I don't know why did Zander drink an energy drink every day? That's the dumbest thing you could do to your health and stuff like that, right? So it really matters the lens we bring on the Book of Mormon, and being careful about not interpreting it too much with our own understanding, and coming to it with revelation, and also just coming to it with kind of an ancient perspective in mind.
I like that. And just one of the other things I want to ask in regard to that is, because you were also talking about Joseph Smith, for example, using the term white and delightsome, and then he used the term pure and delightsome. But then we all, and again, I think we've talked about this a bit, so I don't want to beat the dead horse too much. But then you have later interpretations by Brigham Young, for example. Because one of the things that critics of the church will often say is, well, you're just engaging in mental gymnastics. That obviously Joseph Smith, when he wrote the Book of Mormon, that there's going to be racist components to it. So I guess the question that I'm asking here is that even if the Book of Mormon was not, an ancient text, could it still be seen as racist, or is it more of like kind of what you talked about, how he got a lot of things, certain customs correct when it came to how Native Americans, or Nephites, Lamanites, seemed to get a lot of those customs right, and so I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts would be, there, just in regard to that.
Yeah, and that's a question I often ask myself a lot, because it is really hard to get people to come to the text assuming it's ancient, right? I probably wouldn't have done it if I was an investigator and stuff. And so what are the next steps to that? And I don't fully know the answer. I think part of it is, okay, if you can't come to it as an ancient text, then at least come to it just to the text. Right? Look at what the text says, not what Joseph Smith or Brigham Young said. Let's just look at the text then, and let's just see what the text says itself. Does it really have to mean this, based on Brigham Young's ideas, or could it mean something else based on someone else? Like, what does the text say? Does it really say this? Right? And that can get hard with skin of blackness, right? But then if you look at the text, it says skin of blackness here, skin cloth of loins, what is it? Skin of loins, skin of something, right? It has these two verses right next to each other. Looking at the text, that's got to say something, right? You looking at the text only, you got Lehi talking about dark wilderness, dark mist, and then white angel and white Virgin Mary. Looking at the text, that's got to say something. That could say this is symbolic, right? So looking at the text is maybe the next step if someone can't look at it anciently. And you'll get into other complications with that. The text, the text was created by Joseph Smith. So then the question is, do you take Joseph Smith's meaning of this onto there, or do you take the 1830, 1828 Webster Dictionary's meaning onto there? But get as close as you can to the text. That's what I like to at least try to push. And I wish people who were antagonistic against the church did that more, but they'll bring in, something Brigham Young said decades later and use that as the lens, right? When I don't think that's totally fair, and maybe we can all at least get to the point of just looking at the text instead. for Latter-day Saints, it's easier to look at it as an ancient text and things come to life. And like you were saying, it looks like Joseph Smith just got so many things right. And the way we can promote that is by studying the ancient world and then creating videos and podcasts and posts about some ancient evidences in the text and just try to build up its ancient setting even more in a credible way. We don't want to build it up in a pseudoscience type of way. We want to use good scholarship like what you guys are doing here and good science to build it up so that we make a case for an ancient setting. So when people come to it and they're like, I can't look at this as an ancient text, then maybe say, hey, but look at all of this. Does this help? Can it at least help you think about it that way? And then maybe they will, right? Now, of course, in the end, it's all about coming to the scriptures openly with an open heart and praying about it and seeking God. That's how I got my testimony. As a teenager, I would have never had time to study the ancient world and stuff. Like, this is stuff we like to geek out on, but the main point is to come to it openly, and then you could learn about this stuff as you study it more, and after becoming a member, dive into all the awesome ancient scholarship about the Book of Mormon. That increases your faith. It makes a case for your faith, but it's never enough to be the ultimate proof. So you got evidences. Some are weak evidences. Some are great evidences. Some are mediocre evidences. They all pile up. I think there's a ton of evidences for the Book of Mormon, but they'll never reach the point of proof. So evidence leads to proof. And proof will ultimately, for a spiritual book, for a book about a spiritual being, God, can only come through God. And that's the ultimate proof for the Book of Mormon for us, is finding that answer through him in whatever way God would speak to us through revelation, through our hearts and minds, right? So there's different approaches. The spiritual being open to God is always the best. And then we could build our case with textual evidences and archaeological evidences to get people closer to that point.
I really like that. And there's something specific that you said I just really want to touch on real quick, because you're right. I think we can look at this as a text itself rather than just a specific statement made by Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, or any other prophet or apostle, because that's the culture they were engulfed around, this racist culture where hardly anyone was, even people that are abolitionists were, we like to think of people that were abolitionists. Oh, they loved the black, people of African descent. Okay, they loved Native Americans. People will oftentimes praise Abraham Lincoln, and that's one of the things I tell people. I say, great, I love Abraham Lincoln, but go look at some of the stuff that he said on interracial marriage, because even some of the strongest proponents for things like slavery or weren't necessarily in favor of giving these people equal rights. They just weren't comfortable with slavery. Yep. And that's kind of the question I want to ask is, we've talked a little bit about how we should evaluate the text. But a question I had is, as you said, Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon or translated the Book of Mormon. But we also, like you said, have certain statements from Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. And although they have this text themselves, and this goes a little bit more into prophetic fallibility or infallibility, even though we have this text itself, can we still hold Joseph, Brigham, or other prophets to the standard of a prophet despite certain statements that they make or misinterpretations of scriptures that they make? Can we still hold them to the standard of a prophet, though?
I want to say yes. I want to say that even Jesus held his apostles to a higher standard, and his apostles made mistakes, and Jesus chastised them, sometimes very rudely, it seems like. And so I think, like I said earlier, sometimes I'll read events in church history and be like, I wish they would have followed this verse in the Book of Mormon, right? And so I think we could hold them to the standard of the scriptures. Even Joseph Smith, we can compare his actions to what the Book of Mormon says, and other revelations. And that's where the idea of scriptures come in to faiths. A lot of faiths have their own scriptures, and that's kind of their canon, and that means we kind of compare people to it. The thing we sometimes forget is that even within the scriptures, you have people who are prophets who make mistakes. Moses wasn't allowed into the promised land, right? I imagine Brigham Young not being allowed into the promised land because of something he did. The Doctrine and Covenants is full of the Lord chastising Joseph Smith, right? And the Doctrine and Covenants has a lot of verses about imperfect men leading his church. And so I think with apologetics in general, after 10 years at Scripture Central and reading everything we make and doing my own personal study before and after that, I've kind of come to the conclusion that the answer to most things is focusing on the core of our faith. There's really only 12 core things we believe in. Joseph Smith once said, I don't remember the quote, but the fundamentals of our religion is Jesus Christ. He died, he was raised, he saved us. Everything else are just appendages to that. And so there are core truths to our faith that can't change, priesthood, power, family, Jesus Christ for sure, right? Those are kind of the higher things I compare everything to. And if Joseph Smith or Brigham Young did something against those, even minor things, Joseph Smith would get angry at people, right? Does it affect these core truths of our faith? And pretty much every time it doesn't, right? Our faith stands strong. It has a sure foundation despite all the mistakes we've made throughout our history. And that's what I love about it. And so that's why I stay in the church, because I've gotten a witness of those core truths. I've never got a witness of whether Joseph Smith traveling along the plains of the Nephites, discovering bones, if that was true or not. I got a witness of Joseph Smith, the basics of him being a prophet. I never got a witness of, Joseph Smith once did like those measurements around your head. They used to think if you measured the width of your head and stuff, and different measurements of your head, that can determine how intelligent you were. Joseph Smith did some of that. It doesn't mean it's true, right? And I shouldn't be like, oh, Joseph Smith is a false prophet for testing out this weird theory and stuff. I've looked at my palm and wondered, hey, does this mean this and this mean this, right? Even today we bring in our own weird ideas and stuff about things. But if we bring it back to the core truths, I think our faith stands strong, and we can compare, stuff church leaders have done to some of those things, and not be afraid to say, okay, Brigham Young, maybe he wasn't, he didn't follow 100% this idea or here, right? Does it mean he's not a prophet? No. I mean, prophets have made mistakes even in the Bible. And so that's kind of how I think about a lot of that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's a fantastic perspective. Prophets are not exempt from their culture and time period just because they're prophets. And to get back to the basics, whenever we encounter complexities, don't shirk away from them, don't run away from them, but we can anchor ourselves in the teachings and life of Jesus Christ. I really like that. Before we close, though, and we'll link a bunch of the resources that you were alluding to before, just so our readers can, like you said, get access to good scholarship so they can talk to their friends and family and coworkers and whoever else about these things informedly. Before we do that, though, and before we close, could you give us a summary of what we talked about today and what you want our listeners, if they could have one thing they take away from this video, what you would have them take away?
We've talked a lot about looking at the Book of Mormon with different lenses and kind of recognizing that early saints had a 19th century lens that I like to sometimes call cultural baggage that they brought onto it, and the lenses we can use today. A lot about possibilities for skated blackness. As far as what I would like to end with, and we didn't directly talk about this, but it's one of the things I try to promote the most because it solves so many problems, is that there were ancient American people before the Book of Mormon peoples were here, and there were ancient American peoples around the Book of Mormon people. And that's not only a archaeological fact, but the Book of Mormon shows this. It demonstrates how there were other people around them. Anything from why is Jacob practicing polygamy when there's probably only like 50 people in the group, right? How fast they have wars and casualties really quickly. How can the people of Mosiah, when they first meet the people of Zarahemla, be too numerous to number? Why does Sherem have to seek Jacob out? If they were the small community, you just go right next door to his house, right? Why does it say Sherem has to learn his language and his customs and stuff? So many evidences like that point to other people. That I think is necessary, but it also answers a ton of questions. You know, I think you said you had Ugo Perego here on your podcast at one point. It solves the question of DNA. Their DNA would have been lost. It solves the question of archaeology. I mean, archaeologists, ancient peoples built on top of other ancient peoples. You know, the Book of Mormon peoples lived in the time frame of pre-classic Maya. The classic Maya were after, and they built on top of the pre-classic Maya to the point where we've only excavated about 4 or 5% of pre-classic Maya sites. So we haven't even really studied them as much as we want to, right? Civilizations build on top of each other. When battles happen, people go and scavenge for all the swords and valuables, right? That happened in the ancient world with all these indigenous peoples around them. Why can't we find the geography? Well, because they're probably a smaller group surrounded by many different Native American cultures. And when it comes to Native American issues and colonization issues, it can be really sensitive to say that every Native American is a Lamanite, because now you're saying your Navajo traditions, your Navajo culture, your Navajo beliefs, those don't matter. We're going to erase them, put them aside. You're not even Navajo anymore. You're a Lamanite, and who was created by this book and this white man, right? We're replacing you over that. That could be a problem if every person, if the Book of Mormon peoples represent everyone in the Americas. But it's not a problem when you see that there are these ancient peoples around them, in over thousands of years mixing. And now every Native American group can keep its own history, and the Book of Mormon can keep its own history. Now we have to balance it, but it does help with racism issues too, because now we have possible Native American groups showing these guys how to paint their bodies black, right? Or now we can see how the Nephites saw all of these people around him, and for some reason Jacob decides to categorize every Lamanite as everyone around them except Nephites. He changes what it means to be a Lamanite. It's no longer a textual ancestry term. It's now everyone else is a Lamanite, kind of like how we use the word Gentile today. And I share that because not only does it help with DNA and archaeology and colonization, but it helps with racism as well. And I think that's a big thing that we need to push and get out there, not just because it solves problems, not just because it's a great apologetic answer that solves problems, but because the text itself, when you look at it, it suggests those things. And so that's kind of one of the big messages I'm trying to push out there.
I like that. And just kind of sum up what you just said there, I think you highlighted a few things, understanding the cultural baggage oftentimes that we bring, that this, presentism. Are we judging our past by today's standards? And I think even more so, it's important, what we've talked about is not just, for those that might be more critical, it's not just mental gymnastics. It's being willing to learn and see, okay, does this have, certain historical elements that are going to be very important for me to learn, and because ultimately we're doing our best to become like Christ, but we're also looking to understand each other so we can best help each other, and as Mosiah talks about, to mourn with those that mourn, or to comfort those that stand in need of comfort, and I'd also just add to learn with those that are willing to learn. If we are able to do that, I really do feel that we are going to be able to become more like the Savior, and we're also going to be able to truly understand each other, whether that's, if you're a Latter-day Saint, okay, whatever religious tradition or community, tradition that you're a part of, whether you're, Navajo, whatever you are, it helps us to truly understand each other. So this has been a good discussion. This has been a good discussion. So thank you so much, Zander, for being willing to come on today. This has been great. And for everyone, like David was saying earlier, we'll be sure to link what we've talked about in our description. I think it's going to be a little bit long for this episode, but we'll make sure to link a lot of the stuff that we talked about so you can dive more into that. But for everyone watching, this has been another episode of Sword and Spirit, and we'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone.